Hello, I'm Anika from Made to Sew, and welcome to our pattern drafting tutorial on how to draft a V-neck. Now, this is a variation of my free Copen pattern. I'm going to be working with the Copen pattern throughout this tutorial, so if you want to download that pattern, then you can copy exactly what I do. Obviously, if you're working with another pattern and you want to change the neckline, or perhaps you've got your own block, then you're more than welcome to work with those. I'm going to show you how to draft a V-neckline, and in a following tutorial, how to draft a facing. So you're going to need to collect up your pattern drafting supplies. Now, these are going to be the pattern that you want to work with: a sharp pencil, a rubber, a pen, some paper, and a ruler, and French curve if you have one. And then we can begin. We need to start by thinking about the design details that you want to have on your V neckline. The key one is the height of the V. How high or low do you want the point of the V on the neckline to be? And you need to consider this in relation to your bust point, the height or the apex of the bust, which you can see is marked on the mannequin here with a black line. Now, the apex of the bust is the fullest part of the bust, often the nipple area. So you need to consider how low you want that V neckline in relation to this point. You also need to consider where you want the neckline to fall at the shoulder. Do you want it to fall close to the edge of the neck, or do you want it to be positioned out towards the shoulder? How do you want the angle of that neckline to be on your individual body? You also need to consider things at the back neck. How do you want the back neck to sit on your garment? Do you want it to finish up here on the top vertebrae? Do you want it to be lower? Do you want a V-neck in the back as well? Obviously, you need to take into consideration that the back and the front should meet at the shoulder somewhere. There are lots of design details you need to think about as the designer. So collect up your pattern cutting supplies and we can begin. Now, in this tutorial, I'm going to be sharing tips for drafting the V-neckline pattern that you see here. Now, I'm working with my Copen pattern, which is a free pattern that you can download from my website. The idea being that if you're new to pattern cutting, you can download this pattern and work on the same thing that I'm working on here. However, if you have another pattern that you would like to draft a V-neckline on, that is absolutely fine. Or if you're working on your own personal block, again, that's great news. Now, the first thing you're going to need to think about is whether your pattern has seam allowances on it. The Copen pattern has seam allowances included. They're 5/8 of an inch, 1.5 centimetres. Now, when you are pattern drafting, you generally don't want to draft with the seam allowances. Generally, pattern cutting takes place without any seam allowances, and the seam allowances are then added on at the very end of the pattern cutting process, once you're happy with the garment that you have drafted and you've generally tested it. Now, I do understand, though, that you may be wanting to change the neckline of an already existing pattern, like we're doing here. So in those cases, the pattern will already have seam allowances on it. So you have two options here. Either you need to draw them on and remove them, so they're completely out of the equation, and you will then need to add them back on your new lines at the end, or you can do what I've done here and draw them on. I would recommend that you draw yours on with a sharp pencil. I'm only using a Sharpie so that it's clear for you to see. And the red line all the way around these pattern pieces is my seam allowance, so I really know where the seam allowance is. If you are a beginner, though, I do think it's easier to actually cut them off and remove them completely, and then I will show you how to add them back on at the end of the tutorial. So I'll get a fresh pattern and we can begin. As we discussed on the mannequin, you're going to need to make a design decision about a number of things. The first one being, where do you want the V neckline to be on you? How low do you want this to be? And where do you want this to be in relation to your bust point? Now, on my Copen pattern here, the bust point is clearly marked, and the bust point here is actually the apex of your bust. On your pattern, you may have something similar. You may have a circle with a cross in it, or you may just have a horizontal line, which will only show you the line of the bust, not the exact apex. However, that doesn't really matter, and if you don't have a marking at all, all I would do is suggest that you make a sample of the pattern prior to making any design changes. I would always recommend this. If you're working with Copen for the first time, I would recommend that you make up a sample as it is in a cheap fabric, calico, muslin. Try it on and check the fit, because you may want to amend the size or the length of the pattern prior to making some pattern cutting amendments. Now, when you're working with a sample, you actually could draw the little apex on, or if you just have a horizontal line, draw that on. And then when you try it on, you can compare it to the position of your bust. It wants to be the fullest part of your bust and the apex of your bust if you have a cross like so. Compare this to where it is positioned on your body. Your apex or your bust line may be higher or lower than this, and I would then suggest that you record it on the pattern, because it might make a difference as to where you want your neckline to finish. Once you know where your bust point is, you can then consider where you want the neckline, the centre front of the neckline, to finish in relation to your bust point. How much higher than the fullest part of your bust do you want it to be? Or lower, perhaps? It really depends on the design that you're looking for. Now, there are a number of rules that need to be applied with necklines, and it does depend what you're drafting. So we're going to go through a basic V neckline today and draft the V-neck for the red dress that you saw at the start of the tutorial. And I will mention rules and things you need to consider along the way. Now, for the red dress at the start of the tutorial, I positioned the point of the V 2 inches or 5 centimetres above the bust point. So, using my ruler, I will position the ruler so that it is at a right angle to the centre front. I can check that by using the lines in the ruler and check that they're running parallel to the centre front edge of the pattern. Take my pencil, I can mark this. So this is 2 inches or 5 centimetres above the bust apex. Looking down from the neck, it's about 4 inches or 10 centimetres from the edge of the neck, excluding obviously the seam allowance. Now this is probably the lowest I would draft without coming into some problems. Now the problems that you might have depend on your figure to a certain extent. They depend on the fullness of your bust. But if you decide to have a very low V-neck, you can have a problem with the V-neckline gaping. So you need to remove a dart from the neckline. And you would remove a dart by manipulating it out of the neckline into another dart. This is something that's referred to as dart manipulation, and I will be covering a tutorial in that in the coming weeks. Now again, if a much lower neckline is something that you would like to see, let me know, and it's something that I can do a tutorial on in the future. But for now, we'll keep this nice and easy to start with. So this is the base of our neckline. Now the next decision we need to make is, where do we want our neckline to be at the shoulder? Do we want it to be out towards the shoulder or closer in towards the neck? I actually decided for this neckline that I wanted to keep it nice and snug against the neck, in the same position that the Copen pattern already is. However, this is something that you might want to change. Again, there are rules that do need to be considered if you wanted a very wide V neckline. You might have a problem with it gaping, and you would also need to make sure that your back pattern was cut in such a way that it helped to prevent the front neckline from gaping. So again, we'll keep it nice and simple for this tutorial. I'm going to be finishing my V neckline here. Now, I generally draft my V necklines with an ever so slight curve. I just think it's a little bit more flattering, but you can use what you want. Now, I'm obviously working on half of the pattern. This centre front is cut on the fold. If you have a pattern that is one complete piece, perhaps it's asymmetrical, then you would need to remember the curve that you do for the first part of the neckline so that you can mimic it from the other side. I do that by remembering the numbers along my curve. It doesn't matter which numbers you use, because that's going to depend on the shape of the neckline you want. But that would be the kind of what I'm looking for here, I think. I'm going to do this in my Sharpie so that it's nice and clear for you. You would use a pencil. Just like so. And then if I needed to do this on the other side, I would remember that I'm between 8 and 16, I would turn the ruler over and use the same shape to complete the other side. That's if your pattern is cut as one piece or it's asymmetrical. So now I have drawn on the new stitching line for my neck. And remember here that I came into the stitching line, not to the edge of your paper, because the red is my seam allowance. You will have either drawn that on or cut it away. So I now need to consider how this is going to join the back of my pattern. And I'm going to look at the design details I want along the back neckline. Now we're looking at the back of the pattern, and we need to think how we want the neckline to be here. Again, I've drawn on my stitching line, and the red is my stitching line and my seam allowance around the outside of the pattern. Now, do you want the neckline at the back to also be low? Perhaps it's again another V. If you decide to do that, there are more rules that need to be applied so that the pattern is kept on the shoulders. But for this tutorial, I decided to keep the back neckline where it was. I wanted to have this sitting over the sort of top vertebrae or just under the top vertebrae on the back neck. So again, this is very much a traditional V neckline. There's nothing too fancy about it, but it should be a nice pattern cutting exercise for you to start with and is a quick and easy amendment to a pattern. So if I'm keeping the back neckline where it is here, I then need to consider that I'm happy with how the back neck will join the front neck at the shoulder. I didn't change where the front neckline hit the shoulder, but we do need to double check things. I would always recommend whenever you make any changes to a pattern, you need to true the pattern together. So let's take a look at that. Now, to true the pattern, we need to check that the stitching lines at the shoulder are going to be the same. Now, whilst I mention this, the shoulder isn't always an area that will match. There are times when the back shoulder will have ease incorporated in it, so we'll need to be eased in to fit the front. I normally do that in things like jackets and coats because the back of the shoulder or the body is a larger area than the front of the body. Anyway, let's look at how we would do this. You've got a couple of options. The first one is to simply measure it. You could take a ruler and measure the front and compare this to the back. You can use a ruler. If it's a curve, I would use a tape measure on its side, whatever you think is best. Another option is to fold away the seam allowance on one of them and then to position it on top of the other. Match up the shoulder area here and check that when it gets to the neckline, it matches. And you will see that mine doesn't. The reason mine doesn't is because I'm working with Sharpie and the lines are very large and therefore inaccurate. So I would have to reshape this. And here I could use a curve, or I could even do this freehand. You don't have to use the French curve when you're drafting your necklines. You can do them freehand. Just make sure that everything is nice and smooth. So sometimes you'll be able to get the shape you want with the curve and sometimes you won't. Otherwise, you can draw it in by hand. The other way that you can true your seams is actually, rather than folding it, is just looking through the paper. Now, it depends on the thickness of your paper. I pretty much often use this technique when it comes to the pattern cutting paper that I draft with, because that's nice and thin, or tracing paper, because when you're going around curves, it is difficult to fold the seam allowance away. So I would just sort of pivot it like so, making sure that my stitching lines are lined up. Now, the final step is to add the seam allowances onto your pattern. Now, if you've been working with a block, perhaps you remove the seam allowances from this pattern and you're working with that first, and you want to check your design lines that you've drawn, I would recommend making up a sample prior to adding your seam allowances on. If you're making up a sample, you would simply take your pattern without seam allowances to your fabric, pin it on, get the grain line correct, and then draw your seam allowances onto the fabric. That's what I often use for calico or muslin toiles or sample garments. And then once you're happy with the sample garment, you would add your seam allowances onto the pattern like I'm going to show you here. So I'm going to use my ruler. I'm going to measure and add on the 5/8 of an inch, 1.5 centimeters, because that's what this pattern came with. And I'm going to need to pivot the ruler as I work my way down because this isn't a straight line that we drew. all the way from the top to the bottom, and I will go over this in red for you to see. Okay, so this is my new seam allowance. Now I would need to do the same on the back piece as well if I'd made any adjustments. And there you go, I have made a very slight adjustment to the seam allowance on that neck where I made the change, and I have cut off the extra bit of paper. I now need to cut off the extra bit of paper here. So I'm cutting along the edge of my new seam allowance because the blue line is my stitching line. So we've added the seam allowance on here. We've trued everything up, so we're happy with that. And there we go. Now the final step whenever you're drafting any neckline changes is to decide on how you're going to finish the neckline. Are you going to draft a facing? Do you want a facing just around the neck, or do you want an all-in-one facing under the armhole if you're making it sleeveless? Or are you going to bind the neckline? There are a number of ways you can finish the neckline, and it's really up to you as the designer to decide which method is going to work with you. Which method works with your fabric, with the design, and which method do you want to sew? Now with this neckline, I'm going to be drafting a facing, and I'm going to launch that in another tutorial so that I can show you how to draft a standard neckline facing. Join me in that tutorial next week and I will show you how to draft the facings. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial and that you now feel more confident when it comes to changing a neckline to a V neckline on a pattern that you're working with in the future. This is great if you do have a slightly larger bust and perhaps you don't want the neckline to be quite so high, or if V necklines are just really flattering on you. Thanks for watching, and join me on Sunday where I'm going to show you how to sew a V neckline. Thanks for watching and see you soon.